our program. Our next session is the underlying context for hydrogen, global and US perspective. And as I go into that, let me just mention a couple things. In terms of, for the audience, please feel free to type in your questions as you listen to the remarks in the Q&A box, and we are keeping track of that, and we'll make sure we bring the most relevant and interesting questions into the discussion as time permits. For the speakers, so we have 3 speakers in this session, and you are listed in the order you'll go. So Bob Habner, then Daryl Wilson, and Sunita Satyapal. That's the order for you all. You will get a time check from one of our staff. So please let's stick to the time so that we can progress in the agenda in a timely manner. And then finally, before you begin, please also provide a brief introduction of yourself. So with that, let's move into our next session. And to begin us here, we have Bob Habner from the Center for Electromechanics at UT Austin. Bob, over to you.
All right, thank you, Varun. And I don't think I need to introduce myself. I just did that. So what I'd like to do is talk about hydrogen, looking at it as the global opportunity for Texas and the US. Next chart, please. There is what I want to make sure that everyone is clear that there is global enthusiasm. There's billions of dollars being invested in hydrogen today. Europe is driving this to the demand to a large extent because they and the Middle East and North Africa countries are looking as Europe as a market. It's not a secret that what Europe plans to do is import hydrogen and export hydrogen technology. South America, particularly Chile, is looking toward both Europe and Asia as markets, and Asia is developing a hydrogen economy. The reason people are looking at this is because, number one, it helps meet global emission standards, and oh, by the way, it also increases efficiency. So I'm going to be, I'll talk a little bit about the efficiency part. That's not as obvious to some people, so I will give at least one example there. It is, to be perfectly candid, there's also a risk. Most of the applications, hydrogen is too expensive for most of the applications today. We need to drive down the cost of hydrogen. Now, as a world, we've driven down the cost of a lot of things. One of the obvious, or a couple of obvious ones, are semiconductors and solar panels. We've done this. We have a pathway. We know how to do this, but we do need cost reduction. Next slide, please. This is the example on efficiency. On the left-hand side of this chart, we have a 2016 chart that was put together by the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory of starting on the left side, all the energy that came into the United States, and on the right side, all that was used and all that was wasted. And basically, about 2/3 of the energy that comes into the country is given away as waste heat. If we took this chart because we had the data for it, and if we made the simple assumption that everything that's driven by gasoline and diesel and drives on the roads today runs on hydrogen rather than on the fossil fuel, we find out that we're reduced the amount of wasted energy to 60% rather than 66%. So we've got approximately a 10% decrease in the amount of wasted energy nationally just by making the shift to hydrogen. So we do have an efficiency advantage. Next slide, please. But the interest in hydrogen is broader than that, and the reason for that is because if you can take all your fossil fuels, your natural gas, your green natural gas, the emissions from landfills, biomass, and you can take that and using a steam methane reformation process, you can convert that to hydrogen. That does produce CO2. So you can either take the CO2 and sell it and use it where CO2 is needed, or if you happen to be in a place like Texas where you have good places to sequester CO2, you can sequester the CO2. So you can take the CO2 and take it out of the fuel and turn the hydrogen to fuel. The other thing you can do is use electrolysis of water and renewable energy, that wind, solar, hydropower, and you can make hydrogen directly. The third thing you can do is use nuclear power to make hydrogen directly using a high temperature electrolysis from water. And the hydrogen, what do you do with it? You use it in industrial processes. In fact, the main use, the primary use in the United States today is in the petrochemical industry. That's why Texas has a hydrogen industry, because we're making hydrogen and using it in industry for processes. The second thing you can do is for power generation. You can help improve the performance of the grid and potentially provide storage and provide reliability, provide backup. You can reduce the cost of heating, and you can generate improved transportation. And the transportation is particularly interesting because it gives that one of the things that people have been looking for a long time. A problem with cars and trucks is that they emit their CO2 everywhere. And if you run them on hydrogen, if you still use the fossil fuel, you can remove the CO2 at a given point and let them drive over the country, producing nothing but potable water as an output. So the role of hydrogen actually highlights why Texas is so interesting to Texans and to the world as a hydrogen hub. Can I have the next slide, please? And the reason for that is why as Varun mentioned, is we have the NREL chart, that we have one of the largest, if not the largest, pipeline infrastructure in the country. We are the leading domestic producer of hydrogen, okay, so we have some infrastructure, but it really means the important part of this is that we have an experienced workforce. We have people who know how to make, transmit, and use hydrogen. So we don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to educate from scratch. We have an experienced workforce. We have a large presence of companies who are leading in the hydrogen space. And what does that mean? That means we have corporate leadership that understands the hydrogen markets, understands the pros and cons. So we have the management structure that we need in the state. So we have the workers and we have management that already understand hydrogen. Now, we're talking about using renewable energy. We have an abundance of renewable energy in Texas. As the representative pointed out, we have huge amounts of solar and wind power in West Texas, and have already built the power lines to move them to the eastern side of the state. We also have natural gas. We have nuclear power. So we have the ability to generate the hydrogen, to move the hydrogen, and to manage the entire process. We also have the potential for large-scale storage of the hydrogen underground, given the geology of the state. Next slide, please. The second reason we're positioned to lead is because we have academic institutions with relevant programs. And I've listed 5 of the major institutions here. I'll admit I did show our picture because I'm from here. But we have a strong program across the state academically. And universities are important in this for 2 reasons. One, we could do the R&D needed to drive down the cost of technology. And the second one is that's the only place you get the next generation of leaders. The universities are right now educating the people who are really going to be the ones who develop the hydrogen economy. Next, please. Next slide, please. There we are. And just to show that it's not just me talking this, these are just pictures of the scientific leaders at UT in the hydrogen area. This is not the postdocs, not the graduate students, not the undergraduates. These are just the leadership. So we have a lot of individual researchers at UT who have decided that hydrogen is important, and this is an area they're going to devote their time and energy to. Next slide, please. And we've talked about needing research and development and needing economy of scale. I also want to pause for a moment because the economy of scale for high tech is a nuanced situation. It's not like, okay, I know how to build one, let me build 1 million and they'll be cheaper. The best model, the most obvious model, the most popular model, the most widely recognized model is Moore's Law, which the semiconductor industry used. They took money, they provided research, they knew something else, they did innovation, and they made their microprocessors smaller and faster. When they made them smaller and faster, they could sell a lot more into new markets. They made a lot more money. The money could go back into developing the next generation. The next generation, they needed the knowledge and then the innovation. And once every 18 months, they were making their microprocessors smaller, faster, and and they were generating more income so they could continue this. Eventually, it ran out of steam, not because we couldn't do the research, we couldn't do the innovation, but the improvements didn't generate enough funds to make it worth as they did in the past. So that was sort of the end of Moore's law, was a financial decision, not a technical problem. Now we see the same thing in hydrogen. For hydrogen, we're going to need a huge infrastructure. You can say you're going to need billions of dollars to ever make it work. But the U.S. industry's roadmap shows a phased program so that we pick out new applications, we generate funding, that drives down some costs, it provides new opportunities, and we bootstrap our way up over time so that we can develop a broad hydrogen economy using research, using innovation, but at the whole time generating enough funds to keep this engine of innovation alive. Next chart, please. And right now, I'm not a technology prognosticator, so I'm just reflecting the world right here. But right now, it looks like the most promising killer app to make the next step in hydrogen is in trucks. China has already made a huge financial investment in trucks. We have some of the major corporations putting in hydrogen trucks and drives. We have UPS and FedEx with hydrogen delivery vans on the road. I'm happy to say that one of the first was actually designed and built at UT by undergraduate students and is now driving on the roads in California. The reason trucks look interesting is because the fuel cell and battery drivetrain are smaller and lighter than a battery alone. So if you're going to go electric, fuel cell and drivetrain suddenly look very good if what you're trying to do is carry as much of a load as you can. We need to make our powertrain as small as possible. Oh, in addition, you get greater range than on battery alone, so that you can drive it as far as you used to drive your diesel truck, and you have shorter refueling times. You can refuel in times like you did the conventional diesel truck. You don't have to worry about how long this is going to take me to recharge the battery. So we have some, if I combine batteries and fuel cells on a truck, it looks like there's some real advantages. The other advantage when we look for economy of scale is that compared to a lot of the other applications, trucks are cheap. There are millions of trucks in the world, and we make lots of them. We can sell lots of them so that we can make them fairly quickly. They can be sold, and that will drive down the supporting technology cost and provide that financial terrain, that financial virtuous circle that will allow us to generate more funds to provide more and more applications. To trucks, to cars, to industry, to power, to aircraft, who knows where it's going to go. But we need these apps to come along one at a time. Next slide, please. And that's so. The basic takeaway is you can tell I'm excited about hydrogen. I'm putting a lot of my time into it, but I do continue to remind people that right now cost limits hydrogen growth today. Everything we're talking about doing, we need to get the cost down. But the reason we're excited is because there's this huge upside potential that we can do the things that we're doing better, faster, and if we figure out how to do it cheaper. Texas has the economic and the academic base to be a world leader in hydrogen. Very few places in the world have experienced people, experienced companies, the natural resources, the storage, and a core group of researchers. So we have a major advantage. With the effective leadership, the hydrogen economy can be a huge economic benefit for Texas, and in that way, be a benefit for the U.S. and the world. And thank you very much. I think I now turn it over to Varun. Are you taking it back, or do I turn it over to Daryl?
Thank you so much, Bob. Yes, and I will, pass this straight back to Daryl Wilson from the Hydrogen Council. Daryl, over to you. Daryl, can you hear us?
Sorry, nobody's ever done that, left themselves on mute. Can you hear me now okay?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Great to be with you today. I've made many trips to Texas to talk about hydrogen in times past in my former role as the CEO of Hydrogenics, but I'm getting a sense from participating this morning that there's more momentum and excitement and commitment to take action, and so it's great to be part of the agenda today. Let's go to the next slide. I want to talk to you about the Hydrogen Council, which is an international initiative of industry to come together. There's a bit of animation on this slide, so let's just step through and pick up the next pieces. That's great, thank you. So the Hydrogen Council was formed as a consortium of industry participants in hydrogen back in 2017, and it's a similar process to what's happening, I think, these days in Texas among the industrial players, coming together and sharing a vision of what hydrogen could do in the energy economy. Just today, we announced an additional group of members, which takes us well above 100 from 18 countries, 4 continents, representing 6.5 million jobs and almost 19 trillion in company revenue. When industrial leaders start to move on a particular issue, that's generally what makes the world go round. And I understand that you understand that in Texas. So let's talk a little bit about what this group is doing. Next. There are 4 areas where the Council has defined some objectives. We want to unlock some of those markets that Robert has been talking about just in the last presentation and overcome the barriers and the impediments to get hydrogen moving. We want to create significant business opportunities. This is business people doing business, wanting to grow business, and accelerate the massive investment that will be required to deliver on the promise and opportunity of hydrogen. And that means also to engage a whole array of stakeholders around the world, whether that's governments, the public, regulators, standard setting folks, people in academia, etc. So there's a shared understanding of the great promise that hydrogen could deliver for society today. Next. So what we've been doing is trying very hard to keep our feet on the ground. Hydrogen is a sector that in the past, going back into the 1990s, was surrounded with a lot of hype and talk. Those were the days where kind of coming out of the lab and coming into actually delivering some applications. But today we have tremendous momentum, and that's been strongly supported by the activity of the Hydrogen Council to deliver detailed industry data, particularly addressing the point that Robert was just raising around cost. And so what we've been doing is consolidating inputs from our industrial members and then sharing publicly what we see as a future cost down curve. And I'm going to talk extensively this morning about that. In a report which is on our website that we published in January of last year, we project that by 2030, less than 10 years from now, the cost of hydrogen technology will fall sharply, and that will enable 22 applications. I'm going to identify these applications in just a moment. Equivalent to 15% of global energy demand will be competitive in hydrogen. That's not far away. And further, by 2050, we envision that 6 gigatons of CO2 can be abated, 30 million jobs can be provided, and a $2.5 trillion market in hydrogen could be opened up. Today, the market for hydrogen on the industrial side, and again, I understand that it's heavily based as far as the US is concerned in Texas, with more than 40 steam methane reforming plants and a huge production of hydrogen already. Globally, that industrial captive market for hydrogen is worth over 200 billion now. But as hydrogen grows and becomes part of our energy system in an integrated way, by 2050, we foresee that it will be a $2.5 trillion market. The IEA has also published companion investigations and research in this area, and they have shared that they believe by 2050 that hydrogen will represent a 17% contribution of global energy supply use mix. So if you go back to some of the charts that Robert was showing just a minute ago, hydrogen will take its place as a major contributor in the energy economy over the next several decades. Next. We've identified 4 priorities, and the one I want to start with is safety. In the public mind, often when you mention hydrogen, safety comes first and foremost as a concern. The Council has made safety a priority. There's a long history in industry of delivering hydrogen solutions and operating hydrogen solutions, especially in Texas, in a safe manner. You don't often hear about accidents and issues around the use of hydrogen in society, and we want to keep it that way. And so as these applications scale into new public spaces on buses and trucks and trains and many other new applications for using hydrogen as an energy vector, we want to ensure that all of the standards and regulations and practices are in place so that we can deploy hydrogen in society more pervasively, but absolutely safely. That brings us to the next important priority around being the global voice for the industry in hydrogen. There are a lot of misunderstandings about hydrogen, what it can and can't do, and what its place is in society. And so one of our tasks, and even what we're doing today, is to share the hydrogen story, help people understand it, make it more accessible, and show how hydrogen fits into the future of our energy needs. We believe all of this will generate a marketplace for business to transact business. And to do that in the container of a regulatory and standards framework where there's a level and fair playing field, and there's some coherence about the incentives and the stipulations that go around this new hydrogen economy. So those are our priorities in the Hydrogen Council. We've been around 4 years and been active in all of these areas over the last 4 years. And if you're interested in more information about any of these 4 priorities, be sure to visit our website. Next slide. On the website, you're going to find reports, and I just back again to the process of our report making. There are a number of Hydrogen Council members that are going to speak later in this session, and they, along with almost 100 other companies, have come together in a process where they share their forward-looking cost data and projections for various hydrogen technology applications. We process that data through what we call a clean room. So there's no anti-competitive behavior here. All of the information is coming into one confidential place. There's no sharing of that information between companies. And then within our clean room, we consolidate that data and then we publish the aggregated, consolidated information from all of the industrial input. So it's a very high integrity process, which I think offers the best insight in the world into what exactly is going on with this main historical impediment around cost. So you can find some of our historical publications on the website now. We're just going into our annual major CEO meeting next week, and there'll be more publications coming in the coming months. So please make sure to return to the website in the coming weeks and months, and you're going to find more current and up-to-date information there. Next. This is one of the most useful slides that is in our January 2020 report, and will get updated, I think, again in February. Like any 2x2 matrix, the happy place is in the top right-hand corner. In the top right-hand corner of this chart, you have those hydrogen applications which are most competitive against conventional alternatives, and also using the y-axis, those hydrogen applications which are most competitive against alternative low-carbon solutions like batteries, etc. And so in the 2020 rendering of this chart, January of last year, you will see that forklifts, heavy trucks, long distance coaches, SUVs, taxi fleets are all in that happy place of being competitive against incumbent solutions, you know, from a conventional point of view, and also competitive against the low carbon alternatives. So keep an eye out, February, and we'll have another rendition of this chart. What's very encouraging and maybe not surprising is the movement on this chart, and more applications hitting that happy place is indeed exactly what's been happening in the last year as we're refreshing the data year over year. Next slide. This slide makes some comparisons between hydrogen technology and in the green dots, PEM electrolysis. This is the process of making hydrogen from splitting water, and alkaline electrolysis, so the hydrogen generation applications. And then in the light blue and dark blue, the cost trajectory for fuel cell stacks for passenger cars and fuel cell stacks for commercial vehicles. On the balance of the chart, you have the cost learning curves for solar, batteries, and offshore wind. Now you can see those lines lie more to the right of the chart, where there are millions even tens of millions of deployments of solar and wind and battery technology. You can see for the hydrogen applications, we're still starting out in the hundreds and thousands. So we're at the beginning of a journey, but the good news is that the learning curves that we have seen for cost reduction on solar and wind are also going to be replicated as the hydrogen industry scales. So this is good news, and it means that while cost has historically been an impediment, as we start to scale the industry, and that's indeed happening now, and we step through those relatively early phases of hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, we see very dramatic cost reduction, meaning 40, 50, 60% cost reduction, and very significant learning curves over the next 10-year period. So, again, a reminder that all of this information came from the industrial members of the council, confidential cost information processed into a clean room. So I think this is perhaps the highest integrity source and insight into hydrogen technology costs available anywhere in the world. Next slide. With that, I'm going to wrap up, making sure that there's time for some questions. We've got another great panelist coming up, Sunita, a friend, and so I want to make sure there's time for her to share her thoughts.
Great. Thank you so much, Daryl. Next up is Sunita Satyakal, who is in the Department of Energy. Here, Sunita, are you able to join us via video or are you on a call?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great. And there seems to be a delay on the slides, but if someone can present the slides, I can speak to them and start. Yeah, so as soon as you have the slides up, just let me know. And I wanted to start really by thanking all of you. Thanks, Varun, Rob, who is on our Federal Advisory Committee. Before that, Alan Lloyd, and really wanted to emphasize that the regional leadership. Texas definitely has been such a leader of clean energy, and so I'm very excited to hear the interest in hydrogen. And so if you go to my first slide, or slide 2, again, there's a delay here, so assuming you can see slide 2, I wanted to emphasize that obviously on the federal side we're under a major transition. But hydrogen has always been very bipartisan. We just released a DOE-wide strategic plan. You can go to the website hydrogen.energy.gov and emphasize that hydrogen has always been part of an all of the above portfolio, as was mentioned with Texas and SMR, obviously fossil fuels, renewables. We'll see a big interest in decarbonization and clean energy, and then also nuclear. So I did want to acknowledge all of my counterparts. There are multiple offices involved: DOE, fossil energy, nuclear energy, science, ARPA-E. So again, please do take a look at this program plan. And one of the major initiatives at DOE, in fact, the very first workshop we had, one of the early workshops in 2017, was in Texas. So some of you may remember that was in Houston. And the image here shows the H2 at scale graphic, which in many countries is called sector coupling. But again, the primary resources on the left. And today, really all we know is the red circle, today's electric grid, and then the gray at the bottom, so our vast natural gas infrastructure. And if we produced hydrogen, that can really be put on par with electric and natural gas. And the key, again, is multiple end use applications. So as we heard, heavy duty trucks definitely focusing. I'd also like to mention the increasing interest in hydrogen plus CO2 to liquid fuels. We already mentioned petroleum refining, fertilizer production, again, all the bubbles on the right. And today we produce 10 million metric tons of hydrogen in the US. That is about 1/7 of the global supply. And so again, a huge opportunity there for the US. So in terms of the DOE and our role, if you go to the next slide, so that's slide 3, assuming you can see that slide, I did want to emphasize and actually thank many of you who are participating here. One of our key roles is funding R&D, and we have over 1,100 patents, U.S. patents granted as a result of all the innovation and the funding. And it's obviously not just patents, about 30 commercial technologies, and we see another 65 that could be commercial. Examples are shown in the middle there, and these can be, small from supply chain like membranes and so forth, all the way up to complete systems like electrolyzers. And so again, obviously we have a lot of global players here, but for us, with all of your taxpayer dollars, our taxpayer dollars, we are focused obviously on domestic leadership and competitiveness. And we have other mechanisms like the H Prize shown in the middle there. In fact, you will have unit in Texas. You'll hear later on from Nico. But again, here, how do we incentivize the community? And so here, small scale fueler to complement basically as we wait for larger scale infrastructure. Then on the right, I do want to emphasize another key role in terms of first of a kind demonstrations. So we're focusing on how can we de-risk some of those deployments, really help complement what industry is doing early on. So we have first marine application here, electrolyzer on a floating barge in California, refueling, working internationally as well to harmonize codes and standards, first data center project in Utah, world's first ground support equipment, the parcel delivery vans, as you mentioned, as Rob mentioned. So we were funding the FedEx and the UPS. We have a mobile hydrogen fueler, the very first nuclear hydrogen demos. Hopefully you all saw that. We have several projects now launched. Again, many examples here. I won't go through all of them, but emphasize the demonstrations and the value there. And then finally, at the very bottom, I do want to emphasize, especially as we look at potential stimulus funding in the future, a good success story with the Recovery Act. And many of you may remember this a decade ago, where we helped to cost share some of the early fuel cell and backup power units. And now we have over 40,000 commercially deployed without DOE funding. So again, this is just a snapshot showing the type of activities and the role of DOE. So the first question is, where are we today? So we go to the next slide. If you look in the US, we have, again, on the left, you can see thousands of fuel cells. And this is really an exciting time. Again, I haven't, and as Daryl and others know, been in this industry and then government for many years now. So industry just surpassed gigawatt globally in terms of fuel cell shipments. And you can see here, backup power, about 60 buses, 45 stations, mostly in California, but there are multiple states as shown in the bottom, about over 9,000 cars now in the US. As mentioned, huge interest in the heavy duty. So the map shows you at the top, again, SMR, very predominant. Texas, as was mentioned, Texas also has the world's largest geological storage cavern, also the hydrogen plus CO2 capture. And then on the bottom right, you can see the map that we just unveiled showing PEM electrolysis deployments. So we're at about 14 megawatts now. And here too, Texas has some examples, mostly for the semiconductor industry in these examples. And again, this is just one snapshot in time. It's moving very quickly. And so if you go to the next slide, the next question that we always get is, what's the cost of hydrogen? So I think we all know that the cost of hydrogen from SMR is really cheap today in the US, less than $2, $1 to $2. And there are a number of studies, again, big congratulations to the Hydrogen Council for all the well-vetted analysis. I think everyone agrees that there's just so much, so many studies and sort of hype on hydrogen and numbers. So this just shows you, again, a snapshot of the various numbers for hydrogen cost from PEM electrolysis in the green bars. And the bottom line is we can be at $5 to $6 per kilogram, even at 5 to 7 cents per kilowatt hour for hydrogen. And again, all these studies show, big range, but less than $7. And the picture on the right, I do want to quickly emphasize, because we have to get the cost down. I think that's really critical. And if we can use the electrolyzer, so high utilization rates, which is why we're coming in, for instance, with nuclear base load, in addition to intermittents like solar. And if we can get 3 cents a kilowatt hour, which we are already there in many cases, we can easily get less than $2 per kilogram for hydrogen. So just want to emphasize that. And then at the very bottom, talk about our strategy, which is we've just launched H2 New, which is a consortium with industry, our national labs, really targeted on how do we get down to less than $2, $100 per kilowatt. So we have a number of technical targets, again, with industry. And then the second is de-risking deployment. So integrating electrolyzers with the grid. We've done some dynamic response work. We have, again, a lot of industry players involved with our national lab. And then finally, the last bullet is ramping up scale. I think we've all talked about that. And ideally, if we can co-locate some of the large-scale production and end use, which goes to the next slide, 6. And here we have a map of the U.S., if you can see that, and on slide 6, and then shows you examples of our H2 at scale demonstration projects that we are now funding with cost share from industry. So you can see Texas, you'll hear more about that. Midwest, we have nuclear, show some of the other ones. And then on the right, emphasize again that aspect of renewables plus different resources and different end use applications. So the next slide is just zooming in on Texas. And here I did want to have a shout out for some of the projects that we funded. So we've had over 11 million in funding for projects in Texas. The pie chart on the right, just in the last several years. And you can see many of the players there. Frontier, big congratulations. You'll hear more on our H2 at scale project and their subcontracts, obviously in Texas, as Rob had mentioned. And here too, these are estimates of funding. And you can see the projects in the top right, a number of different examples of innovation. And then the map in the bottom, we have our national labs, as was mentioned, NREL, we have Argonne, we have a number of labs involved in this NREL analysis, looking really county by county, again, across the U.S. on what are potential opportunities. We have resource analysis, that's a report that was published, and this one shows potential demand analysis for different applications. So again, having strategic analysis that can quantify opportunities and basically show the business case. So I think that is I think really, really critical going forward. Since though it's not just about one-off demonstrations here and there, I think we have to think, very, very holistically. What's the resource availability, water availability, where does it make sense, and how can we get to scale? So I want to end with the last slide, which is, again, how do we engage? Very happy to speak with any of you. We have hundreds of projects, work across the states, and we have labs, as many of you know. DOE has stewardship over our national laboratory system. Huge, incredible capabilities, 50 Nobel Prize winners, very unique resources, and so we've made those available through these lab-based consortia. The two new ones, H2 New on electrolysis, and then the Million Mile Fuel Cell Truck Consortium. They're two putting in tremendous resources, capabilities, so it does not have to be duplicated, bringing in industry. And then the third box shows basically a bridge. How do we, again, provide these resources to industry to help move the needle? So we have about 25 projects through our H2 at Scale consortium that's cost shared. We have strategic partnerships, and I won't go through all of these, the Technology Commercialization Fund, the Center for Hydrogen Safety, which again, I really want to emphasize there, that too came out of our Federal Advisory Committee suggestions. And then finally, the last box on the right shows private sector. So we have forward funding opportunity announcements, many different examples of engaging with the private sector, and then cross-cutting areas in the bottom. So I think the last thing is really, it's so important to collaborate now. There's just so much excitement on hydrogen, but now is really the tipping point, and we want to make sure that we all are rowing in the same boat in the same direction. So thanks again for the leadership to all. I'll turn it over back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sunita, for those remarks. And thank you also for all the work that you support across the nation, and certainly the H2H scale project, about which we'll hear more just in the next session. We do have some time for Q&A. I encourage participants to type their questions in the Q&A box, but we do have a few to get started with. Let me point my first question to Daryl. Daryl, as you go about interacting and really coordinating companies across the world, what's the most challenging part of that work? And in particular, as we try to do something similar, somewhat bottom up here in Texas, what are some lessons and insights that you can offer us to get started? Things that you learned the hard way. How can we get a head start and not making some of those mistakes?
Sure. I think it all comes down to leadership, and you know how to do this in Texas. You went from very limited renewable energy deployment not that long ago to very substantial deployment, especially on the wind side. And what you saw there was entrepreneurial leaders engaging business opportunity and doing that with a good pace. So entrepreneurial leadership is very critical. And then engaging the traditional industrial leadership is critical. And this is part of the strength we've seen in the council. We have a big diverse mix of industries coming together and leaders of companies small and large. And as that cross-fertilization of leaders happens, new ideas, new opportunities come to mind, and then they get acted on because typically industrial leaders have a strong bias for action. So we need to move from the phase where this is a primarily government or primarily academic activity to one that's about catalyzing leaders to come together and conduct business at scale. A large number of small projects, we've done that for decades. What we need is a focused amount of large-scale projects, and in Texas, that's very large scale, of course. You do everything big there, but you have the capacity, you have the history, and I think if government and academia can catalyze and facilitate some of these leaders coming together, then things are going to happen. You've done it before, you can do it again, and as has already been said many times on this call, you have a natural endowment of skills and industrial history and existing deployments on hydrogen. You have the pieces. The critical piece to go to scale now is about industrial leadership.
Great, thank you so much, Daryl. Those are very insightful. Sunita, my next question is for you. As you share with us a little bit, how you interact and coordinate with some of the programs at ARPA-E, and in particular, how do you see this coming together of fundamental science, engineering, research, and then also because in timing and scale are just so important, many of the things that you offer, Daryl and Bob. So tell us a little bit about that interaction.
Sure, and I definitely agree with Daryl. I think now is an important time for industry to be very involved in the deployments, but at the same time, I think there's an important role for R&D, and strategy is really twofold. One is to help enable those deployments. So we have a different number of mechanisms. We have a loan guarantee program. We coordinate very well internally. So we have formal monthly meetings where we're always coordinating. Again, the community is pretty small, so we really know all the main players. But then in terms of the R&D and, for instance, the ARPA-E space, which is innovation, some of the higher risk but potentially high impact areas, that's where, and also in our in other programs like ours, is we also look at funding, for instance, the next generation of technologies. So whether it's alkaline or high temperature electrolysis is a good example where we were funding that, and now we are funding some demonstrations with high temperature electrolysis with nuclear plants. So again, it's really a staged approach where we have the near term. Again, we need to accelerate that, bring in industry, private sector, and then at the same time continue to fund the long term, similar to what we do with batteries, for instance. Obviously there's lithium ion focus now, but there's a lot of interest in solid state batteries and kind of next generation technologies. So it's very similar, and there's very strong coordination across DOE.
Great.
And I should also mention across the agencies. So we also lead an interagency working group with about 10 agencies, and work with DOD and NASA and others as well.
Great, thank you, Sunita. The next question is actually for all of you, because in your capacities you work on this issue of collaboration and coordination across the board. So the question is, it's a question from the audience: how can the various academic institutions collaborate to accelerate the pathway instead of working separately on similar programs? So it's open to any of you. Maybe, Bob, you can get it started, and then, Daryl, as you interact with the companies, you also, I imagine, are interacting with academic and research institutions. So what your experience there has been. So how can academic institutions coordinate rather than just step on each other's toes? Bob, you're on mute.
Right, I just got off. When I was working at DARPA, interestingly, one of the roles that one of my colleagues said that the government had to play was to be the conductor of the orchestra. Industry has to work on action on short terms. Universities are doing the research and development. A key government role is to understand what everybody is doing and help point people together. And so I think one of the things that the ways that the universities can work well together is when government incentivizes that to happen. I've had situations in which an admiral came and put his arm around my shoulders and said, "Bob, you're going to start a consortium, and this is what it's going to do." And that got the university to work together. But you have to have the leadership to say that if you work together, there's a benefit. And the way universities are structured, internally, it's if you work alone and succeed, you benefit. So to make that bonding, you actually need the incentivization from either industry or government. And basically, industry has action and doesn't generally have time. The government can play a key role in doing this, and it's important for the government to do this because as I pointed out, the national labs are really good at doing some kind of research, but the national labs are not educating the next generation of leaders. And the university has to play a key role in this whole thing because that's where the people are coming from that are going to make in 2040 and in 2060 that make this a real business. The CEOs of 2045 are being educated in universities today, and we need to educate them properly. So it's important that we bring these universities together. So that's my so there's no good answer. There's competing forces, and somebody has to make an objective decision that says, yes, it's important that we make these, that we provide a way that these people can work together effectively, and then do it.
Varun, if I can jump in for a second, this was Sunita. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think one example, we struggled with this is, but one example is when we've gone to the consortium approach. So as opposed to funding individual projects, we funded many universities, but this, creating a larger ecosystem where we, obviously we provide the lab resources, but we bring in universities, industry, nonprofits, we have so much activity, safety codes and standards. So, creating that structure where we can help form those partnerships. But I think one piece that's important is continued communication because what we're seeing is there's so many activities, and I think it's valuable, obviously, to have the regional approach, but taking advantage of these more cohesive strategies, such as the Center for Hydrogen Safety. We've launched some STEM to some first workforce development projects. And so again, rather than trying to replicate and creating separate, really duplication, I think to your question, we have some of those, but amplifying them and making sure that, you know, relevant parties are aware of them, I think is one of the challenges. So that's something I'd like to mention. The week of June 7th, we have our annual merit review. You know, we expect thousands of people. I think that's where we can provide a lot of those resources. We have a Clean Cities program. So again, we have a number of programs, and I think the goal, especially I think as we move forward and see a focus on some of our targets of decarbonization and jobs, I think will be very important in the next few years. So I think we can look forward to the follow-up after this meeting.
Darren,
you know, I've been working more than 40 years now, and I've never found a case where you can make people work together. People work together when there's a common objective, when there's focus, a sense of urgency. And on this issue on hydrogen globally, in China, there's a sense of urgency and focus on cleaning up air quality. In Europe, there's a very strong focus on decarbonization and climate change. In the US and in Texas, finding that focus and coalescing that activity around an objective hasn't come so strongly yet, but you need to watch carefully what's happening in the oil and gas industry. As you know, the market cap of some companies has fallen precipitously. There's now very major write-downs on fossil fuel assets. In Canada, I'm speaking to you from Canada this morning, we've seen a huge turnaround in our oil and gas industry in the province of Alberta, recognizing that their future is tied up heavily now with decarbonizing the oil and gas sector, and they've strongly embraced hydrogen. We now have a national strategy we haven't had forever, but focus and urgency and a common goal is what helps people to work together. I think it's true in academia as well.
Great, but thank you so much, Gerald. In closing this session, I would also like to just chime in to say there are areas where coordination, collaboration, interaction certainly are absolutely essential, especially given the time and the skills involved. But then also, when it comes to approaches, scientific discoveries, inventions, there are two. One of the spirits in academia is, as Bob mentioned, this independent pursuit of discovery, and there is competition. The history of academia is replete with great examples of competition at the highest levels of science that generate a great. So there are other areas where you don't necessarily want to coordinate everything because that potentially closes off great potential discoveries. That said, as we just heard, it's very important nonetheless to identify what those areas are where that maximum benefit can be had for this sector and industry in terms of coordination and collaboration. So I really thank all the panelists, Daryl, Bob, Sunita, thank you for joining us. We have a short 10-minute break built in, so please join us back after this break. We'll start sharp 11 a.m. Central Time, US. And so please join us just a couple minutes before that. So please hang with us and we'll see you shortly. Thank you.